Poor Peter. You have to feel sorry for him. In 1 week, he has gone from hero to zero. Last week, you may remember in our reading from Matthew's Gospel, he was the one who seemed to understand fully who Jesus was and what he was about in the midst of their cultural milieu and all the swithering and changing expectations about the person of the Messiah at the time. At least we thought Peter had it right. But as we follow on from last week's excerpt from Matthew's Gospel, as ever in life, we discover that it may not be quite that simple. Because having identified Jesus as the Messiah, when Jesus goes on to explain to Peter fully what this means in practice, that he must go to Jerusalem, endure much suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests, and even be killed, Peter wants to reject it out of hand. Maybe Peter thought he knew what it was for Jesus to be the Messiah, but in truth, he didn't really like its reality or its consequences. Good news turns to bad news. In truth, I want to suggest to us all that we are the same. We prefer the good news to the bad news. But seldom in life does one come without the other. And nowhere is this clearer in our own times, in our own context, than around the issues of the environment and our care for creation. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first Sunday in creation time, a month in the ecumenical liturgical calendar set aside for us as churches to grapple with what it means to be stewards of God's creation in our own day, and in the light of the climate crisis we face and all the signs of environmental degradation around us. The very fact that across all their divisions, the world's denominations and churches have in unison set aside this time in the liturgical year speaks to the spiritual importance of how we treat our environment and how we care for the earth and its people. This is not a fringe concern or a niche issue. Given the climate crisis and the challenges we face around the environment that we are passing on to our children, this is a matter of deep concern and the utmost importance. And most importantly for us, it's not only an economic or a social issue, it's actually a spiritual and a theological issue. That's the lens we bring. It's also a great example of how, like Peter, in our own lives of discipleship, often we want to embrace the good news, but when it is also accompanied by some bad news, not so much. And few issues have illustrated this in our own location and time in the last few weeks than issues around the environment. If a pollster came into this room today and asked us all, would we like to live in a city with cleaner air? Would you like the 500,000 asthmatics in London to have a better life with cleaner air? Would you like your children to grow up in a city with clean air? We'd all likely say, of course. Frankly, who doesn't want to live in a community in which you go out and the air is clean? Central London is mercifully keen. Any of you who have travelled to cities across the world, be it Paris close by or Beijing further away, will have experienced the difference, marked difference in air quality and in ease of breathing. And yet, when policymakers act decisively to implement a ULEZ over a wider area, we don't want the bad news that it requires of us a change in lifestyle or a change in habits. It might mean inconvenience or a hit in our pockets. Leaving aside the particularities around ULEZ, in general, we have to acknowledge that often, and in many ways, we find it difficult to move from the general to the particular, that often we greet the necessary sacrifices we are called on to make for the care and nurture of our environment with much less enthusiasm than the principle of saying a good hymn about the joy of creation, or the principle of being good stewards of God's world, and a love of creation that is and must be part of what it means to be Christian in the times we live. Let me give you a telling but trivial example. I was in a cafe with a friend on Friday, and instead of my usual coffee, I bought a bottle of Diet Coke. It was a cafe. It was a service station, actually, so I didn't get a glass. So, undeterred, I screwed open the bottle to drink straight out of it. But the top wouldn't come clean off the bottle of my Diet Coke. After grumpily moaning to my friend, why would anybody make it so difficult to get tops off of bottles, I ripped off its plastic collar, only to spill half of the contents over the table in front of us in my grump. My friend then proceeded to educate me that this was a deliberate policy, because it's recognised that by keeping bottle tops attached to bottles and not letting them come off easy, over 20% of the tops themselves, more than 20% more of the tops, end up being recycled instead of going to landfill. Whoever came up with that idea, I hope they were paid well. What a great idea. Instead of being able just to throw it away and it going to landfill, more of these tops stay with the bottle and they get recycled. Well, needless to say, I was suitably crestfallen, and rightly so. Much like Peter, we might rather prefer to pass over the demands on us placed by discipleship in the practical things of life that make a difference, the annoying limitations it can place on our personal freedoms, the irritations and the inconveniences it puts in our ways, and instead rush to the good news of the gospel in general, rather than letting that good news shine a light on our decisions and our choices in life. And we might think that, Jesus was a bit over the top, scolding Peter by calling him Satan. It's a bit much. But the point is, the devil or evil is not always self-evident. It can be in the detail. It can be in the structural things of society and in our regular, established, taken for granted patterns of living. The truth is that what is wrong in life can even look benign. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. To make a change for what is good is an act of love. And Jesus understood that for good to flourish and for love to prevail in this world, it often requires some kind of sacrifice on all our parts. And here's the rub of the gospel. Sometimes when we give way, or give up, or sacrifice something, initially it feels like loss. But when we do it for others, and when we do it for creation, or when we do it for the good of the world or the community, so often we eventually discover that we receive far more in return for that act of giving than that which we feel we've lost. We sense in our giving away that we also receive in return the abundance of God's kingdom and the dream of God in return, which is far more valuable. So rather than see this way of sacrificial love as a sense of deficit, Paul, in his letter to the Romans, encourages it. He encourages us to see it as a gift. To carry your cross is to embrace a life of love and service for others. And Paul lists all the many different gifts that people have and all the many different ways in which they can contribute, using who they are to their own community, if only they are prepared in community to give a little of themselves, to give up something of themselves for the greater good. He then goes on to describe this way of love in greater detail. He goes on later in that chapter to write, "Rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not repay evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all." This is what Jesus means by carrying your cross. This is what it is to give away from yourself, but to give to others. And in that giving to others, so often we gain so much more in return. This is the life to which we are called as Christian people. We are called to live for others, for friend and for stranger. But also today I want to suggest we are called to live for all of creation. Today we gather with these words of Jesus ringing in our ears, but also with a physical reminder of his own sacrifice set out before us in communion. The extent to which love can and does persevere, and the requisite cost it is prepared to bear. And this good news should not fill us with fear or worry about what may be asked of us, but rather inspire us. Inspire us to be that people, to share in this self-giving love that has the power to transform the world and us for God's glory and for the goodness of all. For as this table is, on one hand, a reminder about the cost of love, it's also a table that bears the fruits of creation, bread and wine, and a table that speaks of the abundance of God's kingdom and the promise of that kingdom, where we are able to live in that love that Paul described. Loving, hoping, and faithfully persevering in that sacrificial way of Christ himself. Amen.